Philosophers.
Fauxlosophers.
So, David, I figure we should continue along our trend talking about taboos and picking out specific things that may or may not be taboo in Western culture, and let's talk through them. And who knows where that'll take us. So, I think this week we should talk about slavery.
Okay.
Or, as some like to put it, the national shame for those in the United States. I don't know if you've heard that term before.
No, I actually haven't heard it put that way before.
Yes. It's not common, but I've heard it used as a synonym in lieu of the word slavery itself, because some people I know are uncomfortable even saying the word. So they would refer to it as, in the United States, they refer to it as our national shame, because it's a common narrative these days. That's how it's often talked about. When you even mention the word in the United States, the cultural context immediately jumps to slavery that existed within the United States from its inception until around 1850 to 1865, until its abolition at that point. And then sometimes it can include things beyond that. So let's start where we always start, with the Oxford. Slavery. As the mass noun, it is the state of being a slave. Very astute, the Oxford. The sub-definitions include the practice or system of owning slaves, a condition of having to work very hard without proper remuneration or appreciation, which is interesting, and excessive dependence on or devotion to something, which is interesting. So, not exactly, I think, what we were looking for as far as the maybe commonly understood definition, but I think those provide some interesting cultural signifiers as to how the word is maybe being used today. To look at the definition of a slave, since that's kind of where the first definition kicks us back to, the definition of being a slave, number one is, especially in the past, a person who is the legal property of another and is forced to obey them. 1.1 is a person who works very hard without proper remuneration or appreciation. Number 1.2 is a person who is excessively dependent on or controlled by something. And number 1.3 is a device or part of one directly controlled by another.
Such as a computer system in which there's a master and slave device.
Right. Another common example is talking about master and slave cassettes from that era for recording one to another. I don't know. I don't think that's something you'd commonly hear about outside of maybe a technical realm, but that's just terminology that is used for microcontrollers quite frequently.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, in common computer setups, it's sort of outdated because now technology has progressed to the point where we don't need to have multiple devices cooperating. We have devices that are good enough to run on their own.
Right. But that's not what we're talking about.
Right.
I think first we should kind of start talking about why slavery first of all, is it a taboo subject?
Yes and no, I think. I mean, it's obviously not taboo because it's something we teach about in public schools and private schools. We see this as something that it's fit to tell children about. So it's obviously not taboo in that regard. I think it's mostly taboo in the sense that it makes people uncomfortable to talk about it. Because, well, especially in the United States, because there is a sense of shame about it that, it's something that it seems so obvious was wrong, but yet we were okay with doing it for so long.
Yes, and I think what's interesting about that is that mechanism or process of reflection on a subject or an activity having been wrong, and it's obvious now. But for some reason, people back then just didn't get it, for instance. and even higher up, the concept of comparing actions in the past by modern standards, for example. Now, I think you have to tread lightly here, because there will be some who will maybe try to, I've heard the cases of people excusing past behaviors under, well, that's just what it was like back then, for example. Would you think that's an acceptable response?
No. I've had many discussions about many different subjects in which this argument was given, that basically the past gets a pass on judgment because times were different, as if that's an excuse. I think that the understanding that everyone the thing is, you can only get people to agree to this until you start bringing up specifics. The concept that if it's wrong now, then it was wrong, and it will remain wrong. Now, I suppose something that might give rise to an exception here is if really significantly circumstances change, as in something happens, maybe a new technology is invented, or something is discovered which totally changes the way that we all interact with one another. In that case, maybe some specific social rules, morals will change because the reasons that we found them wrong are no longer valid. Things like that. I'm open to something like that, but I don't accept the idea that the past gets a pass because we're looking at it through a modern lens. I think that the very fact that we look back and say, or the fact that we say that it's wrong to do it now means there's something we're looking at the past, and we say, well, that's wrong, and we shouldn't do that.
Mm-hmm. Do you think the context of just something being in the past, I would tend to agree with you to begin, to say that just because something happened in the past, and it may or may not have been commonplace, for example, doesn't make it right. And I would also say that goes both ways. You hear it's the common year used a lot, and it's like, well, just because it's the common year or current year doesn't mean anything. Right is right and wrong is wrong. Always has been, always will be. But I would be interested in your thoughts on contexts that may have existed historically that we don't frequently live under today. I'm going to have to shift examples perhaps from slavery to something else, but internment, we'll say, or measures taken in wartime, for example. War was a lot more common in human history than it has been recently, well, at least in the West and involving Western nations. And when I'm talking about war, I mean total war, where entire civilizations are mobilized to war with one another, for example. Does something like that make acceptable or justify certain activities that in peacetime, for example, would be unacceptable? And I'm not saying slavery specifically, but, for example, very mildly rationing, for example. We would consider rationing today to be unacceptable, but it was very commonplace in the United States during both world wars, for example.
I think that exception can be made in some cases. I mean, obviously, the very nature of war excuses something like going into a foreign country and killing people who object to your being there. So if the military just went into some foreign nation and then people protested them being there and the soldiers shot them, this would be an atrocity. But this is the very nature of war. So, of course, it's permissible within the context of war. Now, the case can be made whether war is ever justified, but that's a completely different topic altogether. So if we accept the premise that we've decided that this war is justified, then are certain things permissible that otherwise wouldn't be? Certain things, I would say, yes, have to be.
Okay. And the reason I bring that up is because I think that kind of can reframe, because slavery is not the only thing that gets looked at with the attitude of, well, it was that time. I think what would be helpful is categorizing activities or actions into those which are never justified and those which may or may not have a justification. Like, for instance, the activity of entering into another country and killing the indigenous under the concept of a wartime seems to be justified, at least in the commonly held understanding. People may disagree with it in principle, but historically that seems to be a good enough justification for most, we'll say. For now, we'll leave it. That can be a discussion for another time. I guess what I would want to know is, do you think there could have ever been a justification for something as terrible as slavery?
I don't think so. I think like the closest you could get, really, and my understanding is that this is how slavery sort of started, which was basically the losers of wars become slaves. And so I can sort of see it being the case. You have prisoners of war, and perhaps they have to do work or whatever. I really don't know the what is typical throughout history of what's expected of war prisoners. But the war is over and you continue claiming ownership over people. No, I don't see a justification for it.
So you cannot think of any justifications that would allow for one person becoming the property of another person?
Basically, no. Basically, and perhaps this raises more questions potentially, but I take basically as an axiom that self-ownership is immutable. That and so then of course to be the property of somebody else is a contradiction.
Mm-hmm. In the adult case, anyway.
In the adult case.
In the generic adult case, we'll say.
At least, yes, because as we've discussed before, children break every system we can ever come up with, so.
Yep. We're going to have to sit down and just do an episode about kids one day.
It sounds difficult.
It does, just like kids, but no, I kid. Okay, so that's kind of knocks away some of the justification. It eliminates the possibility of there being a justification that we would believe ever make it morally acceptable. And I think that's important. And I'm sure there are those who may believe that there are justifications. However rare or very, or maybe technologically dependent. I've heard the case made before that civilization would not be what it is today without slavery, because it as a resource, if you neglect the morality of the activity, it's an excellent resource for productivity. And a lot of societies, and you can name every continent that was human inhabited had it in some form or another, but it was very common throughout a lot of history. And it goes back almost as old as humanity itself.
Yeah, so there is truth to this premise. Yes, the world would not be what it is today without slavery.
But that's an end justifies the means.
Well, the world would also not be the same as it is today without smallpox and the Black Plague.
True.
So, just because something happened in history that shaped our situation today doesn't justify it, right? It's the ends do not justify the means. And furthermore, it would be a fallacy to say that because today's situation is a product of historical slavery, that implies that we could not be similarly better off without it.
Yeah, it's a false equivalency.
Right.
And I agree. I feel like in order to be fair, we need to address all of the points. And just a caveat as well. You can't just discount something, even though this may be obviously immoral and never justifiable. It's easy to just say that. But it's always important to hear out justifications other people give, and because there will be those who may think these things on their own, and that doesn't make them a bad person. Just to have the idea or the thought. But when you're allowed to be addressed, you can address those ideas directly, and often you'll find that by understanding where other people were coming from, you can share information that may or may not be persuasive to a different point of view, whereas suppressing it never gives an answer. So anyone who thinks we may or may not be debating the merits of slavery, just please let it be known that we are under the idea that everything can be discussed. That was if you go back to videos and or episodes and watch the video about taboo, the whole point is these things need to be discussed. So, quick disclaimer, before anything bad happens to us. So, okay, well that's slavery in its historical context and in the most literal term of the word. Do you think that it's uncomfortable to be brought up based around maybe some of the... Well, why do you think it's uncomfortable to talk about? Because it clearly is. I feel uncomfortable and had to make a disclaimer just to talk about the subject, unlike I would if we had talked about, bananas. But why do we feel uncomfortable talking about it, besides the fact that it's arguably very grotesque and disturbing to imagine ourselves in that situation?
I think it's because, with the exception of immigrants post 1860s, everyone in America who's the descendant of somebody within the period of slavery has to coexist with others whose ancestors were also part of that system and were on one side or the other of the situation. And it's awkward to think about. This is why it becomes, while raising the subject of slavery is not necessarily taboo, this is a racially sensitive subject, of course. And so it becomes especially taboo to raise the subject of slavery within a mixed race group, I think that has a lot to do with it, and even though we aren't in such a setting right now, I think there might be some conditioning there that in previous situations we were in such settings, and the raising of the topic made us uncomfortable, and so then this carries over whenever the subject is brought up again.
Right. Well, and then there's also the concept that we're making this public to anyone to hear it, so it could be unnerving in that way. But I want to kind of dig into that a little bit, because it seems to be there's another concept being played on that slavery especially tends to it rubs on. The concept, or slavery in the abstract, isn't uncomfortable to talk about, generally speaking. But it's when the uncomfortableness or the taboo nature is kind of dependent on your cultural situation. Now, what's interesting is in the United States, slavery doesn't exist anymore. And in most places in the world, I would argue, it doesn't exist in the literal form of what we say when we mean slavery. To use the technical term chattel slavery, chattel, which is literal ownership of one person to another, not anything figurative, which we can get into those definitions later. let's step back from slavery for a moment and talk about another instance where I think this I'll call it the ancestry issue, or the ancestry posit comes from, or it's found. There was a show previously on, I think it was the History Channel, called the Hatfields and McCoys, for example. Now, this was a feud between two families. And so we're narrowing the scope from races or people of different national origins to just two family groups, which I think before we have discussed can be treated almost as individuals because it's a lot closer to that level. Now, this feud, from my understanding, and even if it doesn't matter, the instance is fine, existed beyond a single generation. Multiple generations of people were in conflict with each other. And there's this concept of, well, why do you hate the McCoys if you ask a Hatfield? Well, the child will say, well, because I was raised to hate them, because my dad hates them. And you ask the father, and it's, well, my father, hates them, and they did this. And you'll find that it's interesting how attitudes pass from one generation to the next, for example. Would you agree that exists on the family level or maybe the individual level as well?
Yes, it definitely does.
Now, do you think that it's very similar? The reason it would be uncomfortable to bring up that feuding family in that family context, do you think the vehicle of ancestral weight is the same? And I'm not talking about in the same intensity, but like the fact of the matter was, I had existing family members that were guilty of something, perhaps, and offended someone on your family ancestry. It's very similar, I think, in the case of feuding families, as it would be for maybe slavery. Now, time dilation is much different between the two, but do you think it's a similar vehicle, that the influence of ancestry, perhaps, even if it's not conscious influence?
Yeah, I guess to extend the analogy of the Hatfields and McCoys, imagine, some generation down the line, they stop hating each other. The kids become so far removed from it that they don't really know any of the details of the conflict, and they're uninterested in it. But it would still be awkward for them to be around, for the Hatfields to be around the McCoys, because they know that there's that history there. My dad hates your dad.
Or even worse, my great-grandfather shot your great-grandfather and killed him,
Right, yeah, something very specific.
Because it's something that actually happened, But I think that brings up an interesting concept, indeed. Because can a person be rid of their ancestry, or was it always a present force on their life? Or is it just a perceived and social constructed force, for example?
I think it is a socially constructed force. I think it's purely a cultural thing that I as a non-psychologist, I'm uncomfortable making any assertions here, but I think that perhaps it has something to do with the delivery of the subject, or just the situations people are in when they learn about it. But maybe it doesn't have to do with that. Maybe it's just maybe it is unavoidable. I'm not sure that that some way or another, when we learn about this subject in school, we sort of internalize our place in the matter. For those of us who are for those of us who either don't know our ancestry or otherwise assume for our ancestry to reach into that period. It's I think it's got something to do with that.
I agree. But there's another interesting concept as well, I think. It's hard for me to shake, to be honest, because it's one of those things where it's like, if it would have been, I wonder, if it would have been anything else, would it be the same? Like, for example, you had an ancestor that was a serial murderer. We like talking about murderers and children a lot, I noticed. But say I had a great-great-grandfather that was a serial murderer, right? Would I bear any of the shame of that? Should I bear any of the shame of that?
Should you? I don't think so. Would you? I don't know.
Okay. I guess now we'll have to separate from the practical case to maybe talking about the principled case. I don't think it's a far-fetched idea for us to say that you cannot be held responsible for the actions of another person, for example.
Right, period, regardless of their relation to you.
Exactly. And at the risk of trying to scapegoat the issue, because I hear this argument made quite a bit, is, well, I never did blank. I never held a slave, for example. Right? This, I think, begins to peek into why this might be a tense issue, because it's in America especially, it's a racially divisive issue. And while you can say, no, you do not directly, I think it would be entirely unfair, and I would argue tooth and nail against the concept that a person can be held responsible for the actions of someone in the past. But we hinted on something last week that I kind of want to bring back in this light, and that is, what about the benefits afforded the person who didn't commit the act? And last week, as a reminder, we brought up the concept of a pregnancy resulting from a rape. And the question that we were discussing, I should say, was the new third party person, we'll say, if allowed to come through the normal progression, would result in a human being, in the average case, a normal human being. They will have directly benefited from a bad thing, a crime. While we can agree that they're not responsible for that crime, is there an injustice done by someone benefiting from an action they did not take inadvertently?
No. I don't think so. And I think you're right that is a lot of where the tension comes from, is that there are at least at a glance there appear to be benefits that people are receiving from their ancestors in this in that situation. And what makes it tense is that because the guilty parties and the real victims, the original victims, are long dead, there's no reconciliation, there's no closure, and so it becomes this unresolved issue that everyone knows can't be resolved, and it makes us uncomfortable.
Right. So I guess now we might look at that, the resolution. How does this issue get resolved? And to preface, I feel like if we knew the answer, we would be Nobel Prize winners, because it is a problem.
Well, I think...
And I don't think anyone's maybe come up with the solution that's been practiced at least, but maybe not one that would work. But I'm curious.
Yeah, I think there is a solution. I think it's actually a very simple solution. The problem is the problem with most good solutions, which is getting people to cooperate. and to agree on the solution. I think the most straightforward approach is move on. The past is the past. We can't fix it. We have other societal problems that arguably come as a result of this, and we instead of focusing on the past, we should just focus on the present and the future and resolve the problems that we see manifest today and find solutions for those that don't involve invoking the sins of the past, I'll use the phrase, to exact revenge on the benefactors.
Why do you think that is, that we can't just... Why is that hard?
Well, there is... So when it comes to the analogy of the family, of the feud between families, there, even while I acknowledge in the abstract that there is no good reason to hold the offspring at fault for the parents, there is still an intuitive notion of, you belong to this group, and this group hurt my group that I belong to. And so...
Well, the tribalistic element, we'll say.
Right, exactly. There's a very tribalistic element to it. And I think some people either are unable to let that go or are unwilling.
I would tend to agree. And I think that process, the acting due to injustice against someone other than yourself, typically resultant of someone else in your tribe, is one of the worst qualities in human beings, I think. I'll just state that outright because I do believe that. And we talked about it a bit when we discussed justice, but you can't truly act on someone else's behalf like that if you had not been personally wronged. Now, I think if you operate as your identity as being a member of that group, then it's homogenized in your opinion, in the way you view yourself. I am we, if you will. Then I guess I could maybe understand, at least logic starting there, not coming from anything else. Forward, sure, I can understand that, but it's fallacious to begin with at that point. But that's a different issue. But I guess the other question I'm asking, I'm sorry. I think that you nailed it. It's that we can't let this go because we still identify with the tribal group that existed in those times as well. And that feeling we get, because people like to talk about justice and injustice as a practical measure, but it comes from an emotion. I firmly believe you literally feel injustice. You don't think something's unjust to start. I think you feel it emotionally, and then you begin to rationalize why it was unjust, and you start looking for a reason. And oftentimes that's where anger comes from. People call righteous anger. If you had to define that, it would be anger that results from the fact that an injustice was committed, and that's that emotion that fuels you towards finding the solution. But in this case, when every original victim and every original perpetrator is long dead, but the effects remain,
Our psychology is not prepared for this situation.
Right.
Because at the time when our tribalistic tendencies developed, we didn't have hundreds of years of history to go look up and see what happened in the past, and to try to retroactively apply blame for things. Now we have this and we're not ready for it, and it's manifest.
Right. So just to recap quickly, a person can't be held responsible for an action they do not take. A. B. The reason we still feel that way, however, there's this intuitive notion that they can, deals with tribal identity mostly. And that's what's preventing us from moving on from that in the psychological sense, perhaps. Do you think there are any other reasons maybe that Well, okay. Do you think there are any other reasons, perhaps, why we can't move on and can't just take the simple solution of, well, let's, from this point forward, we don't do retroactive, scale balancing. We annul it all and just move forward from here and be done with it, right? Or we focus. You can argue about it and you can talk about it. It's important to remember it, but we're going to focus on solving the problems of today and the problems of tomorrow instead of trying to settle restitution for something of the past, for example.
I think the other thing is that the notion of tribalism makes certain people, especially the descendants of the victims in this case, it's hard to say, you're right, we should move on when you feel cheated, right?
Sure, I don't doubt that. Like, to put it in terms that, you and I could find applicable, we play a card game and I steal your money, but you can't prove it, and it was 5 years ago, and you still believe I stole your money, and I still argue that I don't. Neither of us can prove it, and we just kind of stalemate on the issue for 5 years. It's a lot easier for the person who...
Well, it's more like...
My great-great-great-grandfather stole your money. or your...
Well, and we can even keep it close. And yeah, someone in the family, in my family, steals something from someone in your family and gives it to me. I don't know where it came from. This is harder to quantify, this is harder to build the analogy for, because, unless there was something really, really, really special, you probably wouldn't know about it either.
Well, let's go there. Let's say it was a pocket watch that had high monetary value for its time, but it also has like family engravings and it's sentimental. It would be sentimental to me.
This breaks my analogy though, because now we have something very specific that can be identified. The thing that I was going for is that, let's say it was money, then if I've received money and I don't know where it came from, I think somebody in my family gave me a nice gift, and I go, without guilt, to go use it to my benefit. But you, through some means, know that you are short money and you feel cheated. Even if it wasn't yours, maybe you knew that you were supposed to get it and now you don't have it. You see where my analogy was breaking down, though. I
do see where your analogy was broken down, but I am curious, because let's go with the specific case for a moment. Your X generations back ancestor steals the pocket watch from my X generations back ancestor. 50 years go by, we weren't born when this happened. 100 years go by. And by happenstance, you and I run into each other, and I, being your friend, attend a funeral with you for the person who dies that is going to pass this on to you. Upon receiving it, you look at it and you show it to me, and I recognize it as something that's been in photographs of my family, and it's a very specific one-of-a-kind pocket watch, let's say, and I can identify it to a T, right? Do I have any reasonable claim to that item, even though it's so specific and I can prove without a reasonable doubt that it once belonged to someone in my ancestry?
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
But see, the thing, something like that has. See, I think this breaks down too, because the thing is that this is an item with sentimental value that objectively probably isn't worth that much, or I would, if I were to say sell the pocket watch to somebody for money, then I would probably feel guilty about it, knowing that it was your family's pocket watch. And so me personally, unless there was some other circumstance that swayed me, would probably just return the pocket watch to you.
Well, but let's go there. Let's say it was made by a famous jeweler, and it is a one-of-a-kind item that you could auction for millions of dollars, right? Or even better, you don't know specifically who it belongs to. You know it belonged to somebody, and that they probably have ancestors somewhere.
Right.
Let's
Okay.
abstract it a bit.
Now that you've removed it like that, now that I don't have a specific person,
And I think that's a lot closer to the situation.
that's a lot closer, right? And so then I would not feel the pressure to return it, because now I have this ambiguous thing that I would be returning it to, and it's also worth a lot of money. I'm not just going to give it up.
Right. But even if I could prove it to you, do I logically, legally, have any actual claim that I can make against you to make you give it back?
Legally, I don't know. I don't know if it's important.
Well, let's be honest. Okay, frankly, the statute of limitations on theft runs out.
Yeah, fair. Okay, so legally, no.
Legally, no. But not only that, but why would I have a right to take it from you? It's your property. Does the acquisition of how you acquired that property give anyone else a justification on whether or not they can take it from you?
I don't know. And well, I'm also struggling. I'm thinking in the meta here as well.
You have to,
which is a wrong way to approach an analogy. But I'm thinking in the meta here, and I'm thinking of another place the analogy breaks down, is that I have a discernible, specific item that I've inherited as a result of this far removed crime, whereas in the case of historical slavery, I can't point to any of my possessions specifically, which I would not have had that not happened.
I think you underestimate the ability for some to quantify these things. For example, the thing that makes slavery unique is that it is the physical ownership of another person. So that person, by definition, can't have property anyway, because they themselves are property, for example, right? Let's say that. Well, actually, I think we need to clear up a presupposition first. Let's just say I am your slave, and today, morality aside, I am your slave. I am your property, which is the definition. Therefore, any property that I generate as an extension of my work is your property under this system. Now that do you agree so far that that's the chain of how things would work?
Sure, logically, yes.
Sure. I said morality aside. Now let's bring morality back in. In this modern day, someone comes along and they're like, hey, you can't do that, and they emancipate me, and all other types of justice aside, when we come speaking of restitution, would you owe me for all of the things that I had done?
I think so.
Okay.
Now, I don't think this actually happened, but...
No, it didn't. Because you have to keep in mind the way that... I do think one of the other culprits as to why this is still so bitter is because emancipation came with no teeth. Like, that was the approach that was taken back then, is like, these people are free now, we're just going to move on. Which, I imagine people who were freed in that time was kind of like, okay.
It's like, imagine you see someone in the street being assaulted, and, or perhaps, being mugged for their property, and you break up the fight and then let the mugger run off with whatever he may have gotten.
Right. That's what happened. That's pretty much what happened. I mean, I can't say for all certainty that there wasn't any type of restitution laid out, but that's essentially what happened.
You ended the crime without resolving it.
Right. You just put a stop to the crime, and no justice was done there. And I will say this, to people now, we will look at that as go, well, there's your problem. You should have done this. I'm going to bring back that other context we talked about earlier. A war was needed to end this. A war was fought, and the only American Civil War like that, where more Americans and born and would become again Americans, we'll say, because technically Confederate citizens weren't U.S. citizens. I mean, the U.S. said they were, but they didn't consider themselves that. That technicality aside, more people died in that instance than more people died in that war. More Americans died in that war than any other war, I do believe. Especially, even not in the raw numbers, in the percentage of the population.
I think that might be true in the raw numbers as well.
It very well could be. I don't know. I'm not confident enough because there could be maybe one or two other exceptions. But factually, I do know that in percentage of the population, or the adult fighting population, that was the largest percentage, and that's because we were getting killed on both sides, right? So when you end this war, and then you have to divvy up the spoils, but you also have to then reintegrate these people back into society, both the ones who were former slave owners and the ones who were former slaves. They both had to be reintegrated, and again, the attitude at the time, even amongst those who were for emancipation, wasn't entirely unanimously what it would have been today. I think one of the other injustices that's done to people on behalf of education is we are taught about emancipation as though it was what we talk about today as freedom and emancipation, when that's not the case. So it makes it seem like it may or not be one-sided, but not to soften or reconstrue the issue. It's not taught necessarily in an entirely historical context either. But, a war just ended, and I don't know if that's a good enough justification for why the justice wasn't delivered. And ultimately, I don't think it really matters, because that's the truth. Justice wasn't issued. The crime was just ended. So that being said, how do you deal with that? Like
you can't.
You can't. And that's the thing. I feel like to be frank, on the descendants of those who could or could not have been, to those who could have had ancestors, let's work backwards, because that's a little easier to say this, who could or could not have been perpetrators of this crime, most of them don't know. But we still have this tribal shame associated with it. And it sucks, because we can't be, I worry that we can't be the people who say we should just move on. Because there's also this intuitive nature that if you are guilty, you don't get to decide how to resolve the fault, right? And even though we've established that we may not be literally guilty, do we still not get to decide the outcome, because we still have our own interests and things of that nature. Do you see where I'm going with this?
I see where you're going with this, so let's follow that.
Let's, because it's something I feel like a lot of people may or may deal with,
So, a thing that occurred to me is, okay, suppose we decide that even while we are not able to identify who specifically benefits how much from their ancestors and who specifically is the most victimized and disadvantaged, we institute some sort of way in which we generalize people and we redistribute resources in a way that we calculate would resolve the disparity.
For the sake of the argument, let's just say we reach in a perfect situation, you reach a unanimous, acceptable to each individual method of restitution. Or is that what you're talking about?
Well, no, because the thing that I'm going to further assert is that you'll never be able to get it unanimous down to the individual, and then the people who are in the perceived guilty party are themselves going to feel cheated. And we have a different issue.
I know, but I'm saying I want to abstract it, though. Let's abstract it to the perfect case. Would it be right in the perfect case? All pragmatism aside.
Well,
is it still just? Would it be correct to do that?
Well, then we have a tautology. If everyone's okay with it, who cares?
No, but what I'm saying is, in the ideal case, does it make logical sense and is it acceptable for that to happen? And I'm not talking about everyone just accepts it, but everyone to their own satisfaction pretty much just says, yeah, let's just do this, right? Would it be morally and logically correct? If you had all the data points and you could figure out exactly how much each person benefited and how much each person would owe everybody, and you can map it out perfectly because you're God in a sense, and you can just figure this shit out, pardon my language, right? Would that be the correct thing to do?
No.
See, that's the point I'm trying to get at. Like, if it is, then we might work backwards from that. Then run into the pragmatic and realistic problems with it. And then just acknowledge that, yes, that's ideal, but we just can't get there, so maybe get close enough. But
right, because I think in the realistic case that we run into two problems, which is, first of all, the people who had to pay are going to feel stolen from, right? And even then, among those who received, they may still not be satisfied.
Sure, but I want to go...
Because we're so far removed from the real situation that I question whether closure can ever be reached through any means.
I disagree.
Okay.
But I want to finish off the ideal case first, because that's important. Even if you could. And let's go beyond slavery. Let's go to every injustice that's ever been committed by every human being ever, and we can settle the scales today. And like, we invent AI that's capable of that, or we can invent time travel, whatever. Choose your magical mystery box of ways to figure out the solution, but to everyone's satisfaction, we find a way to settle all debts forever. And we all end up where we would have ended up if no one had ever violated anyone's freedoms, for example, right? Would that be the right thing to do? And you said no. Do you retain that answer?
I do still retain this answer.
Why? And it's okay if you're not 100% confident on it. I don't want you to feel like I'm trying to back you in a corner, but because I agree. But why? Why would it still not be right?
I'm tempted to give an answer that was already given, which is, I don't owe anybody.
Right.
Yeah.
So it doesn't matter. Then that's it. And there will be some who disagree. They're like, well, no, but you benefited. And some will say, well, and that's an easy thing to talk about too, because, well, my dad was an asshole and a drunk, and he stifled my education from what I could have had if I would have not had his negative influence. I can't sue him for that. If he never hurt me, beat me, never did anything directly wrong to me, he just raised me wrong, for example, and took away opportunities I would have had otherwise if I could even prove it, which I can't.
Right, or the reverse case of, I do you some favor that you didn't ask for and then claim you owe me for it because you benefited from it.
Right, and that's the thing, is it doesn't work in both ways, but people, I feel, still talk about it like it is that way, and they never go, because oftentimes when I argue, and this isn't just about this issue, but it's any issue, take it to the perfect ideal case. Give them everything they want and give it, and everyone's happy with the end of it. Does it, because first of all, we've established just if everyone was happy doesn't mean it right. Means it doesn't mean it's right or wrong, logically. But that's the thing. Why do we disconnect there? Okay, and it's not just this. We talked about it when we talked about abortion last time. There are things that when you really get down to the nuts and bolts of it, it still would be wrong or it still would be right, the ultimate outcome. But we talk in the case that something would be wrong to do, even in the perfect and most perfect of circumstances, you could arrive at it logically as wrong, but people will still talk about, but practically it'd be correct, and we could work backwards from even the ultimate wrong solution to settle something that's correct. Am I making any sense?
Yeah.
I feel like I'm kind of talking in circles a bit, and that's what I want to know, because that's the truth, I think, when you get down to it, is if that's what pushes us further from the truth, I will say, I guess. we will take things that even in their perfect sense would still be wrong, but they sound good, and everything up to that point may sound good, but we just ignore the cold root of the problem because it's ugly and obvious sometimes, and we may have personal stake in it not becoming true. It's another problem. Like for instance, those who held slaves, I think even then you could make the logical case that it was wrong. And even though it was widely accepted, you could still make the logical case that it was wrong. But it's too easy when you personally benefit from something that's logically wrong. And the tribalistic element of, well, everybody's doing it, or all the people that I know do it, and no one's socially forcing me not to, or no pressures exist on me not to. That's another part of it, I feel like. And that's irritating, And you see it today. It's the same. The vehicles haven't changed. The vehicles and when I say vehicles, I mean the processes and explanations for doing certain things and the logical chains that make up cause to effect as far as people's explanations go. They are the same now as they were a long time ago. A lot of them are. And they still exist, but they're in different issues. And I don't know if you can ever address an issue on that level. But that's, I think, where I'm the most interested. Because we talked about it when we talked about Christianity a while back. And it existed before then, and it exists now. Ultimately, every one of these topics we boil down to, there's a logical chain link of processes that you can take any of these issues and arrive at a solution, or you can take any of these issues and arrive at an outcome. And things that are as radically different as religion to the concept of taboos and why they exist, these processes are in there. And they all are fundamentally broken. But we're just used to them being that way. And in the social realm, when you aren't confronted with the true bare bones of what it is you believe, it's easy to just feel okay with it, and we catch ourselves in that all the time too. When we ask ourselves why we feel this way about something, whether it being right or wrong, for example. But I feel like I've kind of walked down a tangent. I'm done walking down it. But still, it is. I get emotionally upset about it, I do. So I think we talked out chattel slavery, the concept. I would like to end talking about the other uses of the word today, because I feel like they are relevant, because they are used, I feel, to invoke the same emotional or the same maybe response as the literal chattel slavery in a different context. The one I want to pick on today is wage slave.
Somehow I knew you were going to bring that up.
I had to. My personal indignations aside regarding this, sorry, reserving myself. For those of you who have not heard the term wage slave is typically referring to someone, or the concept that working to live is a form of slavery. The fact that you can't just exist in a unfettered state is slavery. And I may not be giving this the full benefit of the doubt because I'm kind of biased, but let me see if I can find the literal definition. Just a second. But anyway, David, you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, basically the idea is that you cannot live without working. And if you have to work for someone, then you are a slave to that someone, because without them, you can't survive.
Yeah, I found the definition. By the way, let me do this one first. Wage slavery. The labor market, as institutionalized under today's market economic system, has been criticized by mainstream socialist and anarcho-syndicalist, did I say that right? Syndicalist, who utilize the term wage slavery as a pejorative or dysphemism for wage labor. They draw the parallels between the trade of labor as a commodity and slavery, for example. That's what they're talking about. So, because I have to choose between employers, we'll say, to make money, because I have to go to someone else to get money, which I can then effectively use to trade to provide for myself, and I have to work to get that, it's slavery because I'm held bondage by those people, because otherwise I couldn't live, for example. Okay. The reason I take super strong issue with this is I will go all the way back to the state of nature. When there is no money, let's say, let's get rid of all the monies, and I plop you down in a meadow in the middle of the United States with no one else around. You will still die if no one else is around and you don't work. The work is different. You just have to feed yourself, clothe yourself, give yourself water, but you will still die if you don't, if I was your employer and I fired you, I'm not sending you a death sentence. Like, I'm cutting you off from your means of survival. No one's entitled to the means of survival, for example.
Right, employment is a mutual relationship.
Yes, but and it also... And some people go as far as to say, well, society has made it to where I have to participate in society in order to live. I don't get the choice. I've heard it also put that in this cheeky ass bumper sticker of a saying, human beings are the only people that have to pay to live on Earth. You would. No. Human beings are the only ones that
have concocted a very, very complicated way of paying to make it on Earth.
Yes, a way that allows individuals to benefit from the mutual struggle of the species, for example, I'll say. Because every animal pays to live here, but instead of getting together with their friends and saying, hey, you make the food, I'll make the den, and I'll trade you food for den, and then expand that times, millions of intricacies. Sorry, I'm having a hard time. We don't need to do these after I get off work because I'm already fried when I get here. But anyway, intricacies, millions of intricacies higher. There we go. It's the same concept, but the fact of the matter is, we could throw you down in the middle of the barren wasteland, and you can go there today. Those who say, I have to live in society, I know you do not. There is an entire continent that we've set aside as the common inheritance of man where you can go, if you so choose. It's called Antarctica. And it's like, yeah, but it's practically death out there. I'm like, well, it's no more practically death than a beautiful oasis in the middle of a desert. We're just not used to it. And the low bar for acceptable skills of survival are insanely different now than they were even 1,000 years ago. Most people don't have to worry about knowing how to feed themselves. And when I say that, I mean acquire the food from its natural source anymore, for example.
Right, almost nobody knows how to farm anymore.
Right.
Farming is a specialized field now.
Yes, because now one person can farm enough for literally millions of people nowadays. In some places, the output ratio.
Right, well, and even among farmers, a rice farmer doesn't necessarily know how to farm something else.
Exactly. But, if I threw you down in the wilderness and said, figure it out, most people wouldn't even begin to know what to look at to eat. Like, what is even edible? And even if I could find something that's edible, it's like, how confident am I that it's edible? And then
right, exactly. You go into the woods and you find some berries. Cool, berries. But will they kill me?
Well, with sample size of 1, let's find out. So I absolutely detest that term. I think it's absolutely ridiculous. If anything else, being a wage slave in the way they're describing it, if anything else, is a privilege to be able to participate in a system that willingly allows you to participate within it, especially in capitalism, where each person is a willing participant by definition, or it's not capitalism. Change my mind.
Define willing participant?
A person who participates willingly. I don't know. How do you want to define it?
Well, I guess, okay.
Do you,
Perhaps this gets into us maybe having a dispute over the definition of capitalism.
neat.
That would be interesting.
That would be interesting.
Basically, my thing here is that I would assert that capitalism is actually the default system. And so it is questionable whether we can say that all humans are willing participants in life as a system, if we can call it that. And so therefore, everyone must be a participant in capitalism, but may or may not be willing.
Okay. But I don't think that would be any more or less willing than the fact that, if you don't move out of the way of a tree that's falling down due to wind, you're going to die. Yeah, you don't willingly get to choose between life or death. Any other alternative other than moving or staying still, but that's nature. No one's necessarily forcing that on you. It's,
Nature doesn't care about your problems.
Yeah, nature doesn't care about your feelings or your problems and stuff. So anyway, I dislike the term. I think it's absolutely ridiculous. I think a lot of, I like to personally poke fun at Rousseau about this, the philosopher. He had the concept that in the state of nature it was all beautiful and we all just frolicked around and screwed and ate berries off trees and were happy because everything was plentiful because there were few humans and it was all great. No.
No.
But if you believe that, then it's, I think, easy to understand where, well, now I gotta work. I can't just frolic around and eat berries and stuff.
No, it's like now you have to work in an office, or maybe your hardest job might be digging a ditch,
Right.
which is hard work, but still it's nothing compared to being chased by lions.
Right, because when you get off that hard work, you get to go to an enclosed space that is usually climate controlled and have access to, this miracle that's called the internet, at least in the United States and the Western world, where all of these amenities are available.
Right, yeah. You get to go home to your climate controlled box that you can afford to live in on your own work, as opposed to, being out in the savannah surrounded in all directions by things that want to kill you. And in which there is no escape from the heat and the mosquitoes that are trying to eat you alive.
Right. Oh, and by the way, in your little climate-controlled box, you can eat food that has been specially catered and prepared for humans by a network of thousands of other humans from all over the world, and it tastes good, and it's easy, and you can sleep in a bed that same network of thousands of different people put together for you that you only had to pay maybe one day's salary's worth. Oof, I don't know. I like poking fun at it because it's absolutely absurd on every level when you really get into it. I think there might be a meritorious debate to be had over drawing the distinctions between, the meritorious debate to be had over, well, is capitalism a force of nature or not? Or is it people? Where do you draw the line between, well, it's people making you, or it's people making you do things or not, or nature making you do things or not?
Well, people are a force of nature.
Oof. Ooh. Sounds like I know what our next episode's going to be about.
That could be fun.
That could be fun. We'll discuss it. Maybe not next time, but definitely go on the list. So, yeah, that's the other term you hear slavery used in, wage slavery. I think it's just got a lot of hype because of the more formal term. And so whenever someone throws that phrasing of the word, when that qualified version of the word around, people's ears perk up, and it merits it. It earns more of a conversation than I think the topic's actually worth. And the judgment aside on whether or not it's a right or wrong thing to take a word that people will perk up at and then qualify it in a way to mean something entirely different. Whether that's right or wrong, that's a discussion for a different time. But to be fair, we went through it. So that all being said, I do think we haven't even begun to really scratch the deep down surface issues on a lot of this. I'm glad we did it. I don't have any regrets about talking about it. And while I definitely don't think we have any true answers, and we may not even have accurately identified the problem, I think I'm satisfied with the progress we've made as far as our mutual understanding of the subject, which is really the only benefit I ever absolutely expect. You may not come across something that might be more true or less true, but you sure as well will understand your conceptions and maybe the perceptions of others about a topic. So another thing that goes to show, when you acknowledge it's a taboo and you go right into it, it's a lot easier to talk about, back to the taboo subject as well. So any last words for this one, David?
Shout outs to CGP Gray's new video about boarding airplanes
Ooh.
and how even when a perfect system can be identified as a solution for a problem, people still will not cooperate because of psychology.
Yes, we hadn't discussed that yet. I watched that yesterday as well. Fantastic video. Glad to see he's finally made a new one because it's been seemingly forever since his last one. But
yeah, I think it's a little bit relevant to what we talked about here today.
Yeah, a tad bit. Definitely. That's weird. I didn't think about that. Now I'm starting to see the parallels. All right. Well, Fauxlosophers.